Well, it's lovely to be here. There's no doubt about that, and it's a terrific honor. It meant that since you invited me, and I should also say that Alex was the person who truly put it together until very recent weeks when you took over. He was the person with whom and I wish him all best luck. I've never actually properly met him, but I feel I know him from his very gracious correspondence. So obviously from here again, solidarity. Since I arrived, Daniel Langton, well, Dr. Dreyfus just said that he's a bit of a yeke. I take that to be a terribly well-organized and highly functioning individual, which I aspire to be. But every aspect since I arrived, so much consideration, you know, every aspect of making me comfortable and being able to run the School of History in London from Manchester. So everything has been done. So I'm really, really grateful for that. I'm also painfully aware that I'm competing with the champions who are now marching, and they've no doubt attracted a part, an infinitesimal part perhaps, of our audience. And there's also a massive alumni event going on right now, so we've had apologies. So I know what it's like for all the planning in the world, in my school as well. On a given evening you can have 3 events that totally clash. In any case, we will make the best of this wonderful opportunity. So as I said, having been invited and given this honor, I've been thinking really hard about really all the very interesting ways in which Jews are studied nowadays. Yesterday at the community lecture we talked a bit about historiography, but I shan't go over the last sort of 150 years or 170 years of really intense preoccupation with academic Jewish history. I'm trying to think of really what is happening right now and how it's come about. And I shall do so not by giving a survey of communities by regions, and not necessarily always a chronological set of developments, but rather I'll try to identify how Christians thought about Jews in medieval Europe and to what effect. Now, I take ideas very seriously because ideas have a way of becoming actions. They don't automatically become actions, but I'm very interested as a historian in how an idea might become realized. I am totally aware that a person can write a thought down in a manuscript that will remain in his monastery forever, never seen by another pair of eyes. I'm fully aware that a particular vitriolic preacher can give a sermon that he thinks is extremely moving, and I know that there are preachers in this room, people who preach regularly, and others don't quite agree and don't go away with quite the message, either in terms of its intensity or indeed its actual content. So I'm aware that turning ideas into action is not a straightforward process to identify historically, but I want to take ideas very seriously. I want to take words very seriously because they're never just thoughts and words. Thoughts and words have the potential to affect the lives of others. So these lectures will constantly hover between the ideas that were developed by those whose job it was to develop ideas in medieval Europe, whose job it was to be the intellectuals of this Christian culture, to think about how to realize and convince people of the truth of Christianity. And very often that went hand in hand with thinking about the deficiencies, as it were, of Judaism and the ways in which Christianity had triumphed over Judaism. The fact that people return to doing so again and again shows that this is an issue that never goes away. This is an issue, this is a discussion and a debate that never went away, that was never in any sense a result, could not be just resolved for Christians in medieval Europe. So the first lecture, today's lecture, after a set of introductory reflections, I'm going to lay out some situations in which discussions and debates between Jews and Christians took place in the medieval centuries, which, as you know, the Middle Ages is 1,000 years, but sort of particularly between about 1000 to 1300. Tomorrow evening, following what I hope will be a very interesting postgraduate workshop, I should explore ideas about the Jewish body, but also about the embodied aspect of Christian religion. It is, after all, a religion of incarnation, and how the two met and clashed. On Wednesday, we will consider how and to what purpose children appear so centrally and so prominently in some of the stories about Jews, while also peering very little, but nonetheless, I hope interestingly, into some worlds of Jewish childhoods. And the last lecture is dedicated to the exchanges around objects that took place between Jews and Christians. I call that lecture Jews and Material Christianity, and Material Christianity is a gesture to the book, the very recent book of the great medievalist Caroline Walker Bynum, which explores the contradictions that arise from the religion of the word becoming so very much preoccupied with the ways in which it shows itself and it's experienced through material objects. And since I know this is a very mixed audience in terms of backgrounds, interests, there are some very young learners here, and there are some very experienced heads as well. I shall on occasion just go into forays of explanation or maybe historiographical orientations, and I hope those of you who know it all will excuse me and maybe just switch off for a little while, but then of course return. Okay, so when I began my studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the mid-1970s, Jewish history was taught in one building, and that we called general history, which is from the German Allgemeine Geschichte, in another building. That's just to remind you of that beautiful campus that was left in order to move to Mount Scopus. The student bodies of these two departments were absolutely separate, as were their teachers at the time. Indeed, we, the general historians, considered ourselves quite the cut above, very sophisticated and interesting, and we thought that those in the other building who were doing Jewish history were rather parochial. When we studied the Crusades, of course we were in Jerusalem after all, so when we studied the Crusades, for example, yes, we probably noted the massacres against the Jews that occurred on the way to the Crusade in the Rhineland in 1096, more than our counterparts maybe who were studying the Crusades in Manchester or in Paris at the time. But on the whole, we saw ourselves as preoccupied with Europe's history, with the sort of mainstream history, and we did not really pay very much attention to Jewish history at all. Being Israeli students, that is largely ignorant of Christianity, we were also required at the end of the first semester, which ended with the Hanukkah holidays, to read one of the Gospels and the entry in the Encyclopedia Judaica, which is called Christian Scripture. And armed with this preparation, we had to pass an exam. And we absolutely had to pass an exam in order to go on in one's study of European history. And that was rather good, and we then sort of obviously became quite expert. And when I came to Cambridge to do my PhD, I knew far more systematically about a Christian religion than a lot of the people doing PhDs with me from England actually knew. And so there was a way in which, since we were going to understand medieval Europe, and we're going to get on with it. So, we were always visiting in our summer holidays and whatnot, visiting Europe in order to develop those skills. So when I traveled to Cambridge in 1981, as you heard from my doctoral research, I was totally ignorant of the fact that I had lived through something of a revolution that was about to bring those two separate entities very closely together, a real rapprochement. I might have seen a telltale sign of this change had I been perhaps more attentive, because in some of the advanced research seminars that I attended in Jerusalem as an MA student, and these were cast very much like the German, Hochseminar, very much in the tradition of Hebrew U, which was very Mitteleuropa, with a tyrannical professor at the head and all of us sitting there and sort of smiling and hoping to do our best and actually quite scared. In any case, in one of these seminars, there was a person who had come across the boundary, who'd crossed the boundary. And this was Israel Yuval, one of our peers in age, but quite more brilliant than most. And he is now indeed one of the absolutely leading historians, perhaps the most fertile in some ways, historians of medieval Ashkenazi Jewry, who is working and functioning today. And on the right is his very great and controversial book. So he was there with us, and he felt he had to learn Latin, and he felt he had to know a whole lot. And he sat with us in our classes, and he studied with us, European experts as it were, and read our texts with us and prepared with us just like everyone else. So when I came to do my PhD, I chose a topic that seemed to me, quite important. It brings together religion and social practice, the study of charity in the Middle Ages, and I pursue it, never thinking that I would become particularly interested or indeed, come across sources related to the Jews in my studies. I was ever so wrong. So those times, the late 70s and 80s, were a very, very exciting time to be doing history in general. By the 1980s, many of the aspirations and the struggles over history, which had begun with the big social movements in the 60s and the 70s, had been won, had already gone a certain way to establish a capacious history. There was growing confidence in areas like women's history. Gender was proving to be a most useful category for historical analysis. The impact of the French Annales school continued to inspire forays by historians into popular cultures. There was a thriving urban history, and in England in particular, there was a lively interest in manorial economies, in the lives of serfs and the work on manors because of the survival of such very rich documentation. Literary scholars and historians were shyly becoming acquainted, and historians were learning to use images for more than just a beautiful illustration for their book covers. Interesting new methods were now being developed for the study of serial materials, that is, vast bodies of data, tax returns, censuses, records of ecclesiastical and secular courts, accounts and notarial deposits, by combining the impact of aggregation of large bodies of data, and of course this is also the beginning of computation in the service of history, with of course also all the sensitive methods that we've learned from people like Carlo Ginzburg and Natalie Davis about how to read documents, also just as a unique example of some sort of interesting enunciation. The influence of Michel Foucault's insight was also trickling down, even to those who knew him only by third or fourth hand, which I consider to be most historians really. So there was a tremendous ferment, and we were trying to bring into history all those groups who had been traditionally forgotten or ignored or considered not important enough, to make a history that would no longer condescend, make invisible large groups of people in the past. Robert Darnton described the resulting historical activity as something as an odd turn, in his words. In a review he wrote in the New York Review of Books in 1986 of the state of the field, he wrote, "But the most recent run of publications suggests a new range of subjects, some stranger than the other. We have had books on the lesbian nun, the anorexic saint, the wild boy, and the pregnant man. We have had dog saints and cat massacres." Very self-referential, clearly. "We possess a whole library of works on madmen, criminals, witches, and beggars. Why this penchant for the offbeat and the marginal?" Such patrician disdain could not stand in the way of the desire to give voice. Indeed, to the strange new subjects, as he calls them, historians were going to give not just, we're adding now strange shapes, or that's the only word I can think of it, that is, after or at the moment when history came to include indeed all these different groups that had not really been studied or indeed respected in the past, the Jews amongst them, there are other trends that started developing. So, for example, there's a real desire to look at history in a more global way, and I don't mean just literally embracing the whole world, but to think about the ways in which, for example, Africa could be to the medieval people not just a source of black slaves for southern European households in the 14th, 15th century, but a place that you dream about and that you imagine about. You even imagine that the Garden of Eden was in Africa for example. And there's another type of shape that people are now giving to history, for which Natalie Davis calls it braided history, history like a plait made of all these different, strands, but others have called entangled history, histoire croisée, in the term coined by Michael Werner and Benedikt Zimmermann. That is, history that is always made of interlocking strands of different hues and textures, but necessarily meeting, intersecting, always in flux. And so in the history of the Jews in medieval Europe too. And the change has not taken place without pain, without controversy, and indeed lament, because there is a venerable tradition of studying Jews within Judaica, with all the tools of understanding the workings of Jewish communities, the traditions of writings, the activities, as they were studied in Jewish history in the 1970s in that building apart. But everything that's happened to history, and a lot that has happened in the world, has also suggested that Jewish history would benefit from being touched by these developments, by this opening up towards considerations that maybe Jewish history has different types of shapes, not a people on its own struggling for survival heroically alone, but other ways, a people touched by the environments and the landscapes of the places that they had to call home, even as they were yearning and their heart was far in the east. So over the last decades, then, we find that a lot of change has occurred, and indeed that book that I showed just a minute ago was extremely controversial. I'll return to that in terms of trying to change the shape. And as you see here, Two Nations in Your Womb is a reference to the fact that Israel Yuval's project has really been to see Judaism and Christianity from the beginning of Christianity as locked in polemic with each other, but not a polemic from which you can just step back and go home, polemic over. Always one that is structuring and influencing both sides very dramatically as they think about themselves. But there was pain around the issue of shaking about and changing the shape, perhaps, of Jewish history, because Jewish history has been embedded over centuries, not in the chronicles of kingdoms and cities or the annals of great monasteries. The historical memory of Jews in the Middle Ages was contained overall and poignantly in liturgical laments and in the books of the dead. It was entwined in community and personal devotions, and thus was treated as a sacred task, remembering, zachor, like the ancient pietas that Romans felt towards their ancestors. Some of that mood of sacred academic work still prevails, say in a documentation center like Yad Vashem, where rules of academic rigor coexist alongside a sort of threnody of memory. Who dare disrupt these rhythms with the thrills of social history and the chutzpah of deconstruction? So there is really a tension here in terms of where people feel they can situate themselves now in a much more open and capacious field of doing Jewish history. But this new type of work of Jewish history in the round, let's call it, is being done. And it's extremely interesting. It's interesting as a social practice, how it's done, how people get together, how they cooperate, as much as for its academic fruits. Just as women's history is now written both by men and by women, just as African American history, written by those who might have been descendants of slave owners as well as by those who are descendants of slaves, so the history of Jews and the relations between Christians and Jews are subjects which fascinate and inspire historians of diverse professional and personal backgrounds. This comes to show that the intellectual public sphere offered by our universities and by our academies is capacious and relatively tolerant, accepting. So we now witness an array of approaches to Jewish history, some preoccupied with the workings of the Jewish communities themselves, others with the traditions of rabbinical thought, but an exciting and intellectually challenging approach aims to situate Jews within their European environments. And of course, in Iberia, that's not just a question of Jews and Christians, but of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. This new history sees no separate spheres and no no-go areas. It expects the polemical relationship between Jews and Christians to have been at times a most intimate embrace. For polemic indeed does have the way of structuring ways of thinking and being. It also expects influences galore to have prevailed. While the synagogue resounded with laments over massacres perpetrated by Christians, it did so even within a space decorated by, indeed illuminated by, windows which are pure Gothic. Like in Prague, when Jews celebrated Passover at table, they often read narratives of redemption from books, Haggadot, illustrated by Christian artists. In turn, when Christians did theological work, they sought exacting challenges to their ideas by imagining, what would a Jew say about that? They had conversations in their minds, and sometimes with real Jews, about the absolutely central tenets of their beliefs, of their religion. So medieval historians are now deeply aware that the history of the Jews in Europe is part of Europe's past, and they seek to reconstitute it even beyond expulsions and displacements. Historians of Jews recognize that living in medieval Europe shaped in important ways the mentalities of Jews, clearly ideas about marriage, about piety, about family and authority, those aspects that seem so central and intimate to a community's life. Medieval historians also recognize that understanding Jews better makes simply for better history. And yesterday evening we discussed in some detail a number of very striking examples in English history. So there is a parallel here, I think, also with something that strikes me about one of the most brilliant historians of the British Isles, who I had the pleasure to work with in Oxford, but he is late and lamented now. That is Rhys Davies, and he's a historian of medieval Wales. Now, being Welsh-speaking and very patriotic, Rhys Davies he became a medievalist, and he started writing rigorous, fantastically, beautifully written books about the history of medieval Wales. And he might have continued doing that, indeed, as a work both of history and of piety, a mission for the history of his people. But he went one step further, and he made a compelling argument, which is now absolutely accepted by all, that, you know, you don't really understand England, the English crown, you don't understand the rule from Westminster if you do not understand Wales. That is, if you do not understand Wales and the resources that this peculiarly run part of England in the 12th and 13th century, in the period, well, after the conquest and until the late 13th century under Edward I, the sort of things, the sort of resources, what the kings could do with lands in Wales, which were ruled differently from lands in England, the resources that gave them the ability to act differently from how they acted when they were dealing with lands and their barons and England itself, less fettered, incomes coming in streams that were most acceptable. This is very much like the situation that we have if we look, say, at England or France in the Middle Ages, or indeed even parts of the Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, where we think about the Jews and the sort of capacities the Jews gave rulers, financial, fiscal, administrative, that they did not have in other places, that did not have with their subjects, with their Christian subjects, so that there is something very at the heart of politics, which resides at the heart of politics, that you can only see when you understand the Jews and their place in the polity, just as Davies argued, if you understood Wales in the English polity, or the polity ruled from Westminster. It's difficult to know what to call it. So the Jews at the heart of Europe offer a privileged vantage point onto the operations of European politics and identities. Their ideas and practices were deeply imprinted by the environments they lived in, landscapes, townscapes, bells and music, images and processions. Yes, Jews comment about them all. And when we take all this into account, the lives of the Jews of Ashkenaz, which scholars have for decades treated as defiantly separate, bravely self-protecting, arise as creative explorations of the possible, through comparison, through testing of boundaries, and through wonder. And as a result, Europe itself is better understood for its diversities and its fault lines. Now, from the 4th century, as I'm sure you all know, around the Mediterranean, Roman culture, literary, material, legal, merged with the teachings of Christianity to create something new, that is, to create the life of a Christian empire. It's a new type of civic life. Christianity became established in the course of the 5th century, that is, in the 4th century, Christianity becomes licit and starts spreading its influence and capacities, and in the 5th century it becomes the religion, the official religion of the empire, marked by majesty, but it was always also a local religion, as Peter Brown, the very great Peter Brown, has taught us to understand. He has taught us well to think about these communities, the cities with their many churches and diverse groups, and the countryside where charismatic men in black offered consolation and example. The imperial presence sought to imprint itself through programmatic councils, where the great councils of the church, where what it is to be a Christian was actually decided, or what it is to believe as a Christian was decided, and through a vast array of influences on the aesthetic of worship, on the liturgy, on the vestments, on the visual habits of Christianity. So the 5th century thus saw the realization of imperial religion, I'll just keep it there for a moment, the realization of imperial religion in law, legislation, of course, legislation which starts putting impediments and disabilities around the lives of pagans and Jews, and the transformation of it into quite unique entity, a Christian empire. And when the Western Empire loses its Western part of the empire loses its imperial shape, it is nonetheless taken over by barbarian kings who were in very many ways really Roman barbarians, and in a lot of ways continued the structures of the church, continued to legislate very much in the Roman tradition, and very much enjoyed everything that the Roman system could give them now, not as chieftains and heads of moving groups, but as settled kings. So we're talking about the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and so on. Cities continued to form hubs of culture and commerce, administration and fiscality, and in most there were long-standing Jewish communities living within that legal framework I've just described. This was the century, the 5th, of Augustine's influential pronouncements on the relation between the old law and the new, that Jews were testimony to the truth of Christianity, that their acquaintance with the Hebrew Bible made them useful sort of like book carriers or librarians in service of the church, and that their eventual conversion was part of the Christian story. A 5th century text, and which had been for long misattributed to Augustine, in a way, and not obviously as important as his oeuvre, I think nonetheless dramatizes the thinking and the relationship between Judaism and Christianity as conceived. This is a text called the De Alternatione Ecclesiae et Synagogae, in its cast as a court case, as it were, when a woman representing Judaism and a woman sort of church and synagogue are sort of arguing it out in church as to who has the right idea. And it's basically a war of biblical citations. And it ends with Ecclesia, church, pronouncing triumphantly, and so know, she says to her, that you are damned by the sword, that you are struck by your own testament, by the words of your prophets, Jews all. Therefore I have demonstrated none of my proof from them, and have kept the Gospels and the Apostles to me and mine. She says, I could have used the prophets against you, but you totally do not understand the import of their prophecies, so I have worked against you only with examples from the Gospels. And synagoga in this text professes to be indeed defeated by the words of her own prophets. So bishops like Augustine, although he is really rather an extraordinary leader in so many ways, but nonetheless religion was nourished throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, where it was growing, and into Europe, into northern and northwestern Europe, by these leaders in Iberia, in Italy, in Burgundy, and into Gaul, where there were old settlements, but as I said, into areas that are becoming Christian anew for the first time. It was growing in these new areas where bishops were really showing leadership, some bishops, some missionaries. But these civic cultures and the texts created in the 4th and 5th centuries, these texts of polemic and triumph, continued to be the material that animated debate. This is material that travels throughout the early medieval centuries, and it's authoritative. So the occasional Roman barbarian legislates new laws, but it's within the intellectual framework very much created in the 5th. So for example, if we just look at Hispania, at Iberia, the province taken over by the Visigoths, their attitudes to Jews were fundamentally based on the Roman law of the 5th and 6th centuries, but they occasionally added their own local twists. And it's quite interesting to see that when Jews depend on the legislation of kings, sometimes the attitudes can really, really change from one reign to another if, a son is trying to assert himself, as it were, against his father before him. So, for example, King Recared tolerated Jewish presence in Spain in 589, but his successor Sisebut introduced harsh economic restrictions against Jewish labor. King Recenswith required in 681 the Jews convert or go into exile, whatever he may be. The Jew shall have his head shaved, receive 100 lashes, and pay the required penalty of exile unless he does so. There was also restriction on what Jews can do in terms of holding, owning slaves, and that's quite important in an agricultural society. So what I'm trying to convey to you is that in the area of theology, there is quite a sound basis that doesn't change, and then the local situations and the local aspirations of rulers in the many kingdoms that now form European political life would have affected these old Jewish communities that have been there for centuries in different ways. Jews, but it's important to remember that Jews worked as much in the fields as they did in the cities, and in almost all professions, except, of course, professions that brought them into contact with imperial authority. So they were less likely to become great officials holding offices in the cities by this time. But it's quite important to remember, even as I say this, that there were lots of professions that were open to them. Also, very important findings of the work of Michael Toch in recent years, which show that people used to talk a lot about how Jews were harbingers of international trade when there was no trade in Europe at all in the 7th or 8th or 9th centuries. We actually don't find a lot of evidence of that. We must think of most Jews before the year 1000 working within communities under some disabilities in law, but doing the jobs that everybody did except for church and high administration. So as I say, most theological lore then was created in that 4th and 5th century, a literature of polemic, but a literature that carved out a place for the Jews. On the other hand, the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries are actually very interesting periods in terms of the dissemination of new types of material for Christian societies. And this is true both in the Eastern Mediterranean and even beyond it, as well as in the West as recipients. So what I mean to say is that in the 6th and 7th centuries, we find that Christian culture is exploring in a way some of the areas that aren't covered terribly well in the Gospels, areas that perhaps have to do with devotional life. A good area to show is the whole lore around the Virgin Mary. I mean, as you know, the Virgin Mary has some absolutely crucial parts to play in the Gospels and is of course recorded there, particularly around the Nativity, the dramas of the Nativity and so on. But there are lots of aspects of Mary's life that are not covered by the Gospels, and so we find around the year 500 that there's already quite a mature exploration of new genre, new writings, and all the different vernaculars of the Christian world, you know, in Coptic, in Armenian, in Syriacs, in Greek, and all this then gets translated into Latin. So we have here in these early medieval centuries a lot of creativity in those very old and fertile and intellectually quite sophisticated parts of the Christian world. But, you know, after a little while, they tend to be translated into Latin and to reach Europe as well. And one area that really attracted a lot of attention is what happened to Mary after Christ's death. What happened to this mother who had nurtured a son and seen him die, as it were? Recently, the great Irish writer Colm Tóibín thought about that deeply and wrote a play which then became a best-selling book, The Testament of Mary. And thanks to the work of Stephen Shoemaker, we now know a great deal about the great diversity and preoccupation with this aspect. And the interesting thing is that as these narratives developed about what happened to Mary after her son died, you know, how did she cope? Well, it was claimed that she continued his mission. She hung out with the, you know, she spent time with the apostles. She sometimes effected cures herself. She moved to Bethlehem. She was harassed by the local authorities. There are lots of different versions, very interesting ones, as what you can imagine what becomes of Mary after her son's death. But what is very interesting, that this preoccupation with Mary in these early centuries, early medieval centuries, becomes a site for reflecting very closely about the Jews. As one of the texts, one of the Syriac versions says, the Jews hated the Lady Mary greatly. And that is the tone that then controls or influences and structures a real, you know, there are about 50 or 60 versions of these types of stories about Mary's end. Because the real dilemma is, what do you do with Mary? I mean, Mary is, of course, a human, but she's a very special human. You can't just let her die and sort of like everyone else and just be buried, or can you? And that is where the creativity arises. How do you imagine a death that makes sense for the human person Mary, given who she really is? So the idea is, that develops, is that in all these different texts, some of them related, some of them independent, is that Mary was given a very special privilege by her son, the privilege of sort of falling asleep, not quite dying, and ultimately being assumed into heaven, where she sits to his right. And it's so interesting how these tender narratives about the Virgin Mary, full of piety and devotion, are also deeply, deeply anti-Jewish. It's as if the Jew is the one who you have to convince that this is Mary's end, or the Jew imagined as someone who had caused her all the pain of her son's death, or indeed of a harassment of her after his death. So just to give you a sense of one of these texts, this is a Coptic homily on this issue. Where are you now, O ignorant Jew, the murderer of his Lord? This one who does evil to those who do good to him. Let him come here today and be ashamed of himself, hearing of all the testimonies, even of his own people, which have previously prophesied concerning this virgin and her blessed birthing, and then going on and praising Mary. And it's totally redolent, of course, of the language of the Song of Songs, which early became attached to Mary, exalted above all, O beautiful dove, right, my bride without blemish. So this extremely rich sort of array of thinking about the Virgin Mary that is deeply, deeply linked up with a constant ongoing polemic against Jews. And what's important for us as historians of medieval Europe is that this buzz of creativity in the East, the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, was one that was ultimately translated and reached Europe, and it gives and it provides the material really and the underpinning for what will be around 1100 or 1200 the liturgies for the greatest summer feast in the Catholic calendar, which is of course 15 August, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. And just to show you how this is realized visually in this here English Psalter of the 14th century, you see at the bottom left, as it were, Mary falling asleep, having this special end, a dormition, not a death. Then to the right, it is the rising of her soul. Well, is it a soul, or does she rise in the body? There's debate about that. And ultimately where she resides, which is there in heaven with her son. So this period is producing some of the earliest stories that are not theological discussion, that go out there in the vernaculars and imagine the Jew within a context of Christian devotion. Another area, another story that became extremely well known is again born in the Greek in the 5th and then translated into the Latin in the 6th century, and that is the story of a Jewish boy. It is told in the most influential version by that arch storyteller Gregory, Bishop of Tours, in the 6th century. So the story is about the son of a Jewish glass worker who was studying in some town, studying his alphabet with Christian boys. One day, while the ritual of the Mass was being celebrated in the Church of the Blessed Mary, the Jewish boy approached with the other young boys to partake in the glorious body and blood of the Lord. After receiving the Holy Eucharist, he happily returned to his father's house. However likely or unlikely this is how the story is imagined. You know, kids together, he goes in with them to this church and they're given communion. This is maybe how they took communion in the 6th century. No kids were just given communion off the street by the 12th century or so. But this is the story that is told. Then the boy goes home. And because and his father receives him and is very happy to see him because he's a bit late. So the father says, so what were you up to today? And he says, oh, I had a great time. I went with my friends to a church, and then there's this lady there with a baby, and they gave me something to eat. And the father is absolutely outraged, picks up the kid, throws him into the oven. That's why it has to be a glass blower. You understand the sort of narrative logic here. So he's thrown into the oven, the angry Jewish father. So here, the casting the Jewish father as being cruel, even to the fact that because he is so outraged on religious grounds, he would kill his own son. But lo and behold, when the mother arrives, the mother is never involved. The mother is always not, she's never the perpetrator. We'll return to that tomorrow. She comes home. Where is the boy? She looks into the fire, and there he's sitting safe and sound. And when he comes out unscathed, when they bring him out, he says, the woman who was sitting on the throne in the church, where I received the bread at the table, from the table, and who was cradling a young boy in her lap, covered me with her cloak so that the fire did not devour me. You can guess who that was. Son and mother and others in the community were so moved by this miracle of Mary, we are told that they all converted. And the father, you've probably guessed this as well, was thrown into the oven. Now, this story is one of the most popular. It is often decorated, illuminated. It gives it's a subject for wall paintings and for stained glass windows in Europe, in cathedrals and other settings from the 11th, 12th century on. These are stories born in that first millennium in the fertile East and ultimately reach West. The story was known to the great historian of the English church, Bede, and it was known in the 9th century to a Frankish monk who used it not as a miracle of the Virgin Mary, but as part of a tract in which he figured out the theology of the Eucharist, which is quite interesting, using this Marian story for now a more urgent purpose. So the medieval religious cultures were nurtured and nourished by old Eastern narratives, by the examples of local saints, and by the ideas developed by an intellectual elite in monasteries and cathedrals. Now, the whole shape, of course, of Europe, of the Mediterranean was to change, of the Christian Latin-speaking world was to change, once with the coming of Islam, with the dramatic contraction of the Greek Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire, and of course the loss of the Mediterranean, not just the Mediterranean, but also the coast of the Mediterranean, southern France, coast of Italy, etc., being harassed and raided for decades to come. The whole sort of, there was a very, very great book written in the early 20th century called Mohammed and Charlemagne, and it's a great classic by Henri Pirenne. But there is a certain way in which the shape of Europe now changes, because with obviously more leadership coming from Northern Europe, more safety, a reliance a lot more on agriculturally produced wealth rather than the wealth of trade that still was there in the Mediterranean in the 7th century. So for us, what's dramatic is to remember that if you look at Europe around the year 1000, it's a Europe that now includes, Iceland and Poland and Hungary and Denmark and Ireland and England, Christian polities all. And the European population is also undergoing change. There is vast population growth between about 950 to 1300 to 1250. There is a growth in cities. Because there is enough food around for some people not having any longer to live an agricultural life in order to supply their needs, but rather they can go and become artisans or experts in manufacture or indeed merchants, and they could do so from a city, secure in the knowledge that food will be supplied and services will be supplied and so on. So urban growth it happened both in old centers, in the old Roman civitates and old cities, but also very much in new. And what we see is the Jews then dwelling in the old centers, so big venerable cities like in the south of France, centers like Narbonne, or in Italian cities, but also coming and moving to where opportunities are further north. We find Jewish communities invited by bishops to come, bishops like, for example, the Rhenish bishops of Mainz and Worms, and the Archbishop of Cologne inviting Jews. We don't know what it means by inviting, because often when the charter of invitation is written, it's after there is already de facto settlement of Jews. But clearly the opportunities of commerce in all areas, and also of agricultural development. It's very fascinating to find Jews as big entrepreneurs in viticulture in the Rhineland in this period, amongst other activities. And the Jews thus are present in the cities and present in the mind, so much so that when the group of armed pilgrims who marched through the Rhineland in 1096, as I already mentioned, they knew enough about Jews, and they had enough ideas in their minds about Jews, and also about what they were about to go and do in the Holy Land, that they began the work in those communities. So between 1000 and 1200, population growth, political expansion, commercial intensification, and cultural encounters combined to create one of the most remarkably creative periods in European history. And this meant, of course, that intellectuals, from theologians to lawyers to poets, were engaged in a process of redefinition and exploration and sort of figuring out. But during that century, what's really important to see is every aspect of Christian life is now being thought through by great Western Latin intellectuals. And they do so sometimes in the 11th and 12th century, sometimes already animated very much by classical knowledge that is returning to Europe or reaching Europe now through interesting projects of translation that actually go through Iberia. I won't go into detail about this right now, but some of you may be aware. And reaching Europe and fructifying thought through new texts about logic and later about politics that will animate thought. So what this means, this Europe in flux, this Europe in growth, this Europe in intellectual intensity, what it means is that everything is up for debate within the Christian story. Cur Deus homo? Why did God have to become man? That was the question that asked the great Anselm, who became Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, in the very early 12th. Was Mary, Mother of God, ever touched by original sin? Asked Odo of Cambrai, Bishop of Tournai, in the early 12th in northern France. What is the role of intention in the judgment of human action? An old question, of course, an old question in Judaism, I meant to say, but asked now afresh by the Parisian teacher and philosopher Peter Abelard. The Jew was a privileged sparring partner for those who were now asking and thinking very, very deeply about the shape of Christianity, all of whom were versed in Scripture. And they simply could not understand, or rather wanted to explore how a Jew equally versed in Scripture could simply not see the truth. Odo of Tournai, and I just thought you might want to these images here just to remind you of the world that the image on the left is an icon probably made in Constantinople in the late 6th century, although it ended up in the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai. And you see that frontal Mary, the very majestic imperial Mary, as I always think of her. And then you see the Book of Kells, of course, from the British Isles, but you see that this frontal type of Mary, you see the imprint of what was created in the East, really controlling and inspiring Western culture in the first millennium, Western European Latin culture. But now Europe is creating its own images, and I just thought I would show you here, this here image on the left from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just north to Paris. This image of Jesus there, one hand on ecclesia, church to his right, and one on synagoga to the left. More about that tomorrow. And although you can't see it here because it's slightly destroyed, just to show you in another and very outdoor and public face, although it's destroyed, stone carving showing the same from the church of Saint-Benigne in Dijon. So the same Odo of Tournai, whom I'll use as my exemplum, Bishop of Cambrai, I think we started a bit late, so I still have a few minutes, right? Chose to explore the tenets of faith through discussion with a Jew he called Leo. He wrote a text called Concerning the Advent of Christ, the Son of God. And this is, for the most part, a quite sensible debate, really, not rude, exchanging ideas. The Jew says this, the Jew asks the question, the Christian answers. And he tells us in his prologue that he wrote it for a monk who had once heard him speak about the incarnation. So this monk hears a famous bishop speak. And he said, I really need it written down because I can't quite contain it in my mind. So tells us our author, the Bishop Odo of Tournai, on one day when I went to a council in Poitiers, on that date, I was pressed into a discussion against a certain Jew of Senlis. So it seemed appropriate for me to pursue this question in the form of a dialogue where the Jew asked and I responded. And when one day when the Jew came to our lodging, so you could just imagine there's a council in Poitiers, and the Jew turns up where the ecclesiastical guys are gathering. Is this for business? Is this for what? And he spent some time, well, siesta time is a bit of it's the time when they rested. And towards the 9th hour, he began to speak to us as we were seated together. So this is how Odo describes, as it were, the making of his text. It all came out of a conversation that he had. But it's a subject worthy of discussion. So Leo asks, I do not know how many offer satisfaction for sin through your Christ. I see, however, how sin is corrected under the law. For by petitions and sacrifices, oblations, alms, and other acts of good works, we offer satisfaction for sin to God under law. So a person sins. I understand if they live under Judaism, there are ways for atoning. You do good works, you offer sacrifice, or you had offered sacrifices to the temple, etc. Now, Odo says, you're wrong. Let me explain how it is. Suppose a servant is obligated to his lord for an old debt. Original sin, right? If later on he sins against his lord, how will his later sin be purged by payment of the old debt? You're always paying for the old debt, as it were. Or will settlement of the older debt justly be counted as satisfaction for the later sin? Does not a just lord require something separately, first for the debt and then for the sin? Yes, certainly. I mean, it always ends up with this Jew saying, yes, certainly. And of course, we cannot know, well, it would, wouldn't it? We cannot know if this particular Leo existed, but he could have existed because Jews were around in the cities, and we know the discussions did take place. And we find that in this period of the 11th, 12th centuries, almost every leading intellectual wrote some sort of polemical work with a Jew, with an imagined Jew, against a Jew. They were totally useful to think with, helpful to think with. And on the whole, it takes this fairly, I mean, even when it's vitriolic, it's structured in a in this as it were, reasoned way. on the whole until the end of the 12th century. But what happens when we're not dealing with Latin anymore? And this will be my last exemplum. In his new and very interesting book, Alex Novikov, who is the author of The Medieval Culture of Disputation, Pedagogy, Practice, and Performance, he demonstrates the ways in which the intellectual habits of scholastic reasoning, like the one we saw with Odo of Tournai, had created a frame for disseminating, for having discussions, and it circulated in Latin. But what happens when some of this trickles and moves into the vernacular languages? When you're not expecting this to be a text that you'll share with a few monks who will read it and have a context to fill in the gaps, and will be interested in the core of the argument and don't need a particular amount of excitation. What happens when these debates are imagined as happening with a much wider audience in mind? Maybe the audience for Middle French, like the disputation between church and synagogue, which I shall share with you in a minute, written in early 13th century France, the Disputoison de la synagogue et de Sainte-Église. So it's based on that 5th century text we heard about just about 50 minutes ago, the text once attributed to Augustine, the Altercatio between church and synagogue. It's structured in a similar way, but its tone is totally different. Who is the audience for a French language debate between church and synagogue in the 13th century? It is not theologians. This is for aristocratic delectation. This is for an urban audience, perhaps. We know, in fact, at the beginning of this text, this Disputoison, to remember saying it in proper old French, it's 144 lines long in rhymed quatrains, and we know the poet's name. He is a sort of professional poet called Clopin, and he sets up two women in contention. One is synagogue in red, one is church in red, and one is synagogue in brown, rather dour. He describes their appearance. Church is holding a chalice full of blood, synagogue a lance and nails, a broken lance and nails, I should say. Synagogue starts and demands that church should obey her. Tu me dois obéir. Tu ici de m'école. You should obey me. You come from my school. You know, you're born out of me. I was there first, says synagogue. But church retorts, tais-toi, vieille ribot folle. Shut up, you silly old foolish woman. Tais-toi, malheureuse, later on, and goes on to cite the prophet Isaiah and so on. Now, I'm just going to share a bit of the text with you here, because it's about a particular point that's a theological point that indeed is discussed in the schools and by theologians, here rendered in the vernacular for a quite different set of people and audiences. So you can see both, but I mean, I'll read it just in the English, my English translation. Do you then want to deny to me that the God in whom you believe died as a martyr? He let himself be killed. Surely, if he were God, he would have not allowed himself to be killed. Sort of, that's, as it were, sort of logical. Or, so the answer then is that God's flesh died because it was human, but the pure deity itself never died, never became a martyr. It was whole and unharmed, entière et saine. So I hope what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there is the realm of theology, and it has its own rules. And then there's a realm when some of the ideas from theology turn into text for wider audiences. And it's very important when it reaches, in French, a wider audience of aristocrats, even if they're a small group in the population, because these are the people who are determining the terms of life of Jews. These are the people who are entering business with the Jews. These are the people who have the ability to really affect the well-being of Jews, and they're thinking about them very creatively. And I just wanted to show you just another image of church and synagogue there. You know, you see church on our left, Christ's right, with that chalice, and there we have, with a broken lance, synagogue, just as described there. This movement into the vernacular is a really very powerful move. And I think it explains a lot of the type of, the sort of receptivity that there was in these medieval audiences by the 13th century to ideas of the Jews as killers of Christ and a certain type of piety and devotion that puts Jews as perpetrators in a very negative light in that period. And this is literally, my last example will be the work of a monk from northern France called Gauthier de Coincy. Now, Gauthier de Coincy takes the Latin collection of Marian miracles, which was put together by monks in Bury St. Edmunds in the 1140s. So we're here in the monastic milieu again, in Latin, a collection of stories about the miracles of the Virgin Mary, including indeed the story of the Jewish boy you already know. And he decided to translate it to French. He translated it into French, again, not for the use of other monks in his monastery, who of course would have read the original in the Latin. He does it for dissemination. Indeed, in this collection, Les Miracles de Notre-Dame, he actually addresses sometimes, you grand sir, you great lady, Alice. In one case, he actually a lady called Alice that he. So again, we're getting out there into the political and social realm where Jewish lives are lived. And he's very cross with the rulers of France. He's very cross with the King of France, who allows Jews to dwell in the French kingdom. And he says, I just wanted to show you that some of this is annotated. So clearly these poems were performed and sung for entertainment. And he says, God, Dieux, God, if one day I were king, for the sake of Reims or Rome or of the kingdom, I could not leave even one of them alive, Jews. To tolerate them is an odious thing. Yet Holy Church does just that. For remembering the sacred death which we must all remember, the crucified and the Jews renew the death of God. So he has a totally different idea. What the king does, what the church does is wrong. The Jews should definitely not be there. And this is a translation of a vernacular poem that was copied extremely widely. We have manuscripts with notes, without notes, and so on. So I just wanted to give you a sense here of some of the direction of travel. That what we have is, in the first millennium, the creation of materials that are base materials, that are both theological and polemical, and devotional, as we saw, like the stories about the end of the Virgin Mary. But that lore is being created and recreated, rethought, when Europe goes into this tremendous period of growth in all areas, and where its Jews are prominent in its cities, where its theologians are thinking afresh of everything, and wherever they think and wherever they create, they think about Jews. This is absolutely evident. So the story of Jewish-Christian relations is one of this tremendous intimacy, literally, bodily and material contact in cities as neighbors. For Jews and Christians knew a great deal about each other, living together and in constant exchange. Despite repeated legislation and heated preaching, Jewish and Christian women acted as wet nurses for each other's children, as you hear on Wednesday. Christians pawned their precious garments and belongings to Jews, as we saw yesterday at the lecture, who then kept them labeled and safe in their storerooms. Jews hired Christians to make food for ailing children on the Sabbath. They also fantasized about the meaning of eating God. What can that mean? It is hard for us to know what ordinary Christians thought about Jews. We know they heard more about Jews in the world post-1000, a world now where soon will be created the whole network of parishes as we know them today, where preaching was regular, communion was annual, where churches were decorated with images of the Passion that are extremely, extremely vivid and graphic, and where Jews always play a part. These productions were deeply related, therefore, both to the developments within the ecclesiastical elite, but also to the reach of the church's cultural program and its hegemony in so many areas of European life. So it's a complex whole, which we must understand not as inhering in any one of the groups, Jews or Christians, but rather in the historical unfolding of their relationships. Thank you.